Nuremberg, 1615. A frenzied mob clamors for blood, craving a spectacle of extreme violence. Executioner Franz Schmidt understands the imperative to satisfy this demand, lest he meets a gruesome fate himself. In decades, he's never inflicted such excruciating pain on anyone. Can you fathom the horrifying act Franz is about to commit? This true story will be revealed later in the show. First, let's delve into how medieval torturers harnessed rats as instruments of torment. Rat torture in medieval times. In the medieval ages, certain forms of punishment were standard and codified into law. However, from time to time, sadists would innovate new methods of torture. During this era, some individuals took perverse pleasure in devising the cruelest forms of torment imaginable. Historical evidence of rat torture predominantly comes from the 20th century, as human rights groups documented its use by South American military dictatorships, particularly in Argentina during the 1970s. Rats were employed alongside a device known as a rectoscope. In the 1600s, Germany witnessed a gruesome form of interrogation, involving a cage placed on a man's chest with starving rats enclosed within. The idea behind this method was that the rats would gnaw into the man's flesh, which became even more excruciating if the victim's stomach had been cut beforehand. There are accounts of this method involving a covering placed over the victim's head. During the Dutch revolt against the Spanish Habsburgs, military officer Diederik Sonoy was known for his use of rat torture. The book, The Rise of the Dutch Republic, recounts that Sonoy would place a clay pot on a prisoner's chest and heat it with hot charcoals. The intense heat drove the rats to frenzy, and their only escape was downward, where they would scratch and bite the victim. If the victim already had open wounds, the rats would exacerbate their injuries, causing a gruesome spectacle. Although the rats were supposed to gnaw into the very bowels of the victim, it's doubtful that they could penetrate deep inside. Nonetheless, the risk of infection was substantial in an era when treating infections was challenging. Flaying alive. Flaying, a gruesome method of skinning a person alive, was used during the Ming Dynasty in China. The Hongwu Emperor, Zhu Yuanzhang, known for his brutal reign, engaged in flayings and slow slicings during the 1300s. Flaying was a method of inflicting unspeakable pain, often reserved for those suspected of political conspiracies or other heinous crimes. Victims were subjected to horrific torment, including having their skin peeled off while they were still alive. In some cases, they were quartered or paraded as grotesque effigies. Eunuchs, who had been castrated as part of their punishment, were also used as instruments of the imperial bureaucracy. In the 16th century, one particularly brutal execution involved a military officer named Marco Antonio Bragadin, who was defending the city of Famagusta in modern-day Cyprus. After his army was overwhelmed by Ottoman forces, he was subjected to a prolonged and sadistic execution. Bragadin was mutilated, flayed, and quartered in front of a jeering crowd, and his skin was sewn back together and stuffed with straw before being paraded through the streets. Boiling alive. Boiling alive was another nightmarish method of execution used in various historical contexts. It was a method of inflicting excruciating pain and was employed by Roman Emperor Nero to execute thousands of Christians who were boiled alive in large drums of oil. In medieval England, King Henry VIII included boiling alive as the statutory capital punishment for those found guilty of petty treason, such as killing or violating an authority or social superior. The victim would be lowered into a pot of boiling liquid, such as water, oil, or tar, often with a rope and pulley. The initial contact with the boiling liquid was incredibly painful, and if the victim's head submerged, their death was inevitable. The boiling process caused their flesh to cook and their internal organs to boil within their body. The agony of being boiled alive was prolonged, and it was a horrifying and torturous method of execution. Fortunately, it was eventually removed from the law books in England in 1547. The stocks and pillory. During the Middle Ages, law enforcement was limited, and communities often employed watchmen to maintain order. Criminals were often branded for their offenses and placed in the stocks, where they endured humiliation, mockery, and sometimes even physical harm. The stocks were used for relatively minor offences, such as shoplifting, and were designed to shame and deter wrongdoers rather than inflict severe physical pain. Another form of public punishment was the pillory, which subjected offenders to public ridicule and often resulted in physical harm or even death. Offenders placed in the pillory were at the mercy of the crowd, who might throw objects, mud, or feces at them. In some cases, the crowd's response was so violent that the offender was seriously injured or killed. The Great Witch Hunt, the witch trials during the Middle Ages and the early modern period, resulted in horrific tortures and executions, primarily targeting women accused of witchcraft. The Malleus Maleficarum, a book published in 1486 by a German clergyman, fueled the witch hunts and led to the torture and death of tens of thousands of women and some men. Accused witches were subjected to brutal and sadistic forms of torture, including the use of metal pears, burning, mutilation, and other agonizing methods to extract confessions. Many confessed under torture to escape further torment. Accusations of witchcraft often stemmed from personal disputes, and those who had enemies would exploit the hysteria to have their rivals accused of witchcraft. The torture and execution of accused witches were horrifying spectacles, causing immense suffering and death on a massive scale. Hung, drawn, and quartered. The punishment of hanging, drawing, and quartering was reserved for individuals convicted of high treason, including regicide or other major offenses against the state. The process involved hanging the victim until nearly dead, followed by drawing, disemboweling, and quartering, cutting into 4 parts. The victim would typically be castrated and their entrails displayed before them. Their limbs and head would be removed, and their remains were often displayed in public places as a gruesome warning to others. This brutal punishment aimed to deter individuals from committing crimes against the state. While the specific details of executions and tortures varied, these historical examples showcase the extreme and horrifying methods used to punish and control individuals in different societies and time periods.